And I just want to say welcome back to anyone who's watching this on November the 1st or later. We had to stop because of time on October 16th because we got so in depth with the probate office in the courthouse. And now we're going to go and work on some of the other offices. Got ancestors in other states. The principles may be the same, but they may call them differently. So just do your homework. And I suggest Family Search, looking in the county that you're looking for, has a lot of information about what records are where. So just go to Family Search and go into the research wiki and look up the county you're interested in and see what they have to say. So we're going to work on the court records, land records, and court cases. The other two offices, main offices in the courthouse, are the Superior Court and the Inferior Court. We're going to start with the Inferior Court because they are the one that has the next most wealth of records that would apply to your family or may apply to your family. And those books on those shelves really are that big and that heavy. And some courthouses have had people to come in and take photographs of them, and they are now in little 8.5 by 11 notebooks, but it's not near as interesting to see those as it is to see the actual record that was written in the 1820s. And I'm having difficulty. There we go. Since we covered the judge of probate or the ordinary's office last time, we won't go into that this time. The inferior the deeds, powers of attorney, plats, tax records are all in there. And we'll go into that in depth in just a minute. The other big office in the courthouse is the Clerk of Superior Court, where civil and criminal cases records are held. And in early days, naturalizations were done in the well, actually, after about 1840. Prior to 1840, you had to go to the legislature to get your naturalization. And this is my favorite plat of every plat I've ever seen. It's at the Georgia Archives. It's called the Doodle Plat, or what they call it, the Doodle Plat. It's from the 1700s. And as you can see, you've got a man hunting for a deer, and two men are carrying the chain, making the measurements so that they can mark off the meets and bounds. Your surveyor is up in the top right. And just above the X right here is a Native American watching the man killing his dinner. I've loved this plat for years. I don't know the date of it. I need to look that up. But anyway, it's in the 1700s and it's at the Georgia Archives. Those big books that you saw on the picture on the opening slide are broken up into sections in the Inferior Court office. You've got deed books that have the written description of the piece of property, who is selling it, who's buying it, how much they paid, the date that they paid it, who saw it, the money change hands, and any other appropriate information that is needed to make sure a clear title is maintained on a piece of property. The grantee index is an index that was kept In a separate book, you've got the grantees, the people who are selling the property. No, the grantee, I'm sorry. The grantee is the person receiving the property, whether it's a land, slaves, anything like that. The grantor is the person doing the selling. So, but the indexes are separate. So you've got them alphabetized by the last name, by the grantee, the person buying the property. And in another big book, it's the grantor index as the person selling the property. But those indexes can be misleading because if more than one person is selling the property, the grantee grantor index, or more than one person buying the property, will just say the Latin words et al. Period, et al., which means and others in Latin. So go read the original deed to find out who those others are. A power of attorney, if someone was living away from this county and they could not get back to the county to sign the document to release the title when some of the family property is sold, they would do a power of attorney in the county where they lived. And a copy of that registered power of attorney would also be recorded in the county where the sale was taking place. Also in this office, you find the plats. Remember the doodle plat we just looked at? These are drawings made by the surveyor at the time that the boundaries of that piece of property are surveyed and drawn out. You'll have the compass points and so many degrees south by west and all that sort of thing. There are several good videos on about doing a plat from a deed description online. And it's an interesting exercise. You forget to go right or left when you're changing directions. So if you don't do it right, you can wind up with a strange looking drawing. The deed books and these indexes are usually in the inferior court office because they are frequently used on a weekly basis instead of being in a record room where loose papers and the bound volumes of the early records might be housed down in the basement or the bowels of the courthouse. Lawyers who are involved in transactions and things and land title searches use these on a daily basis. So they have to be easily accessible. Unfortunately, very early on, because it cost so much to travel to the courthouse and you had to pay recording fees, you may not have a transaction recorded in a deed book until much later. And this you would need to follow up. If you don't find a deed for John Doe selling to his son for love and affection for $1, the north half of his plantation where he now lives in 1823 before he died, or when the John Doe, his son James Doe, married, and he gives him this property, it's to set up housekeeping on. It might not be recorded because it's between father and son. But later on, James Doe, the son, may need to sell that property. And he would have to prove to the court that he owns it and why. And hopefully that proof will be recorded when the sale of that property takes place at a later date. So you've got a clear chain of title, who got it as a land grant, who got it from this guy, from that guy, and then from John Doe to James Doe as a deed of gift for love and affection. This is what you really need to look for. If you don't find a deed early on for property you know was in the family, look later and see if when it was sold, died off, there might be documentation of the chain of title. More clues can be found in the actual body of the deed. I know it's a pain to read that awful writing, but believe me, it can be worth it because you learn who the adjoining landowners are, what water courses are there, what creek he's on or river. And if the land that he is buying has 2 acres in swamp and 6 acres upland and 4 acres in forest, it can give you an idea of the load of work that your ancestor had to do to clear the land and make it arable or farmable. If a man and his wife own property and are selling it, the law required that the wife come into the court, or someone from the court will go and see her and question her that she agrees that this sale can take place. This is called relinquishment of dower. It's relinquishment of her share of her husband's estate that she would get on his death, and that she agrees with the sale of this piece of property. If the deed actually says John Doe and his wife Jane are selling this property, you might not have a separate section after the deed saying that Jane Doe has come into the office and sworn before the clerk of the inferior court that she agrees for this sale to take place. That's her dower relinquishment. You won't find that if both the husband and wife are named in the head of the deed as selling the property. So if you see just the man, be sure to look several pages after the end of the deed to see if her dower relinquishment might have been recorded later because they had to go 10 miles down the road to her house because she was bedridden from giving birth to a baby and interview her and find out if she agreed with the sale. If you don't find a dower relinquishment and the wife's name is not mentioned anywhere, it's very possible that his wife is dead at the time that this sale takes place and the deed is recorded. So that can give you a time frame for her lifespan. I mentioned the power of attorney a minute ago. I kind of got ahead of myself. They moved to Kentucky or Missouri or Montana or wherever. It was prohibitively expensive for them to travel back to Georgia to sign away their rights to the property of their father's estate. So they would choose someone that they trusted and send a power of attorney certificate that is recorded in the county where they lived to that person to act for them in the sale of this property. You don't usually find this power of attorney attached to any estate records, though. It's in the deed books. And it's, as I mentioned earlier, it should be recorded both in the county where the heirs lived, where the deed power of attorney started, which shows you where the family went to, as well as in the county where the estate is being divided and the land is sold, or slaves, depending on the time frame. And this also gives you clues of connections of maybe it's a daughter that's moved away and she and her husband are giving power of attorney to her uncle to act in her behalf. So there you go. You've got your daughter and her husband's name and where they went from the family home in Georgia. I've found that if you take time to transcribe the entire deed word for word into a word processing program like Word or WordPerfect that I like to use, you won't miss details that can give you clues down the line. I don't know if you're familiar with the fan club that Elizabeth Shown Mills invented, the family associates and neighbors, people who are interacting with your family, either intermarrying with them, they're business associates, or neighbors who go to church together. All of these people were people that they knew on a day-to-day basis. And when your children grow up and comes time to marry, if they don't leave the neighborhood and find somebody outside the enclave of their usual circuit of life, they marry their neighbors, and these connections can build up over the years. You would be amazed if you trace a line from the early 1600s or 1700s up to the 1900s, how many times these same families intermarried over the years. It's like that old song, I'm my own grandpa kind of thing. I love that the first time I ever heard it. Watch for the deeds of the adjoining landowners too, because if you had intermarriage between those adjoining landowners, you could find that the father of the bride gives the bride and her new husband land that you wouldn't have recorded in your family's name, but it's in the bride's father's name. So that gives you more clues into connections. And always get digital copies. Either take it with your phone if they'll allow it, or have them scan it, or even the old standby of Xerox. By having a copy of that deed in your hot little hands at a later date, 2 o'clock in the morning, you decide, oh, I want to look back and see what that thing said. You've got it, and you can read it. This is a plat. Remember on the doodle plat, the chain carriers and the surveyor with his instrument? This is what they produce and give to the landowner when the land is measured out and the metes and bounds are recorded word for word. And it's just a sketch of what the land looks like. And the writing on the upper left corner says the above plot represents a tract belonging to a portion of the heirs of the estate of Williams Jones deceased, containing 829 acres, as surveyed by me on the 16th and 17th of October, 1885. Signed Dr. Elder, CA. But this plat was done in the from the creek up
Eve,
that way. Yeah.
Eve, I'm sorry, but your voice cut out just after you started this slide, which is odd because it hasn't been happening. But you might want to start, yeah, try
Okay.
starting this slide over.
Okay. This is an example of a plat that you will find in the plat books in the inferior court office. It is basically a sketch of the layout of the land with the measurements and the landmarks, a red oak or a white oak or two rocks. However, they designated a corner where the line changes that's written in the body of the deed. When the family, when the owner buys this property, he pays the surveyor to have it surveyed and recorded in the court records, and hopefully will hold on to a copy of the plat. A copy of the plat stays in the courthouse too. As you can see with this one, the chit of paper on, I think this was written on the back of this plat. The above plot is the way he wrote it. It represents a tract of land belonging to a portion of the heirs of the estate of William Jones, deceased, containing 808.29 acres as surveyed by me on the 16th and 17th of October, 1885. Dr.
It cut out again right after DR.
Dr. Elder is the surveyor. And he and his men went around and walked every inch of this border, sketched out the dimensions, and drew this diagram. Obviously, the William Jones has died. It's 1885, and his heirs are selling the property. So they've had Elder to resurvey it, possibly with the possibility of dividing the land, maybe the north section to the north of the creek being sold to one person, which would be about 400 acres, and the portion on the south part of the creek would be sold to another person. Then those two portions would be resurveyed and re-recorded after the sale to whomever bought it. This book deed is in Deed Book V of the Clark County Inferior Court. And it shows or indicates that a 1 acre piece of land from the estate of, I forgot who it was. I went ahead and transcribed it, of William Matthews, late of said county, deceased. This is 1858. William F. Matthews, his son, is the administrator for William Matthews, who has died. And he names James D. Matthews, Joseph F. Morton, George W. Veal, and all the other members of the family of the late William Matthews, deceased, are the receivers of this deed. For the consideration of $1 by the parties of the second part, he agrees that they have complete title to 1 acre of land on the plantation of the late William Matthews, deceased, wherein his remains and the remains of his deceased wife are interred, beginning at a red oak and running as the annexed plat represents, containing 1 acre. This land is considered sacred by the law of Georgia. And if you want to bulldoze it and build a house on it, somebody who has an interest in it can take this deed to the court and fight them to prevent that happening. It's very interesting to see when you've got a cemetery set aside within a deed, because when in the olden days, they set aside a little piece of land up on top of a hill and usually planted cedar trees around it to sort of set it off from the rest of the farm. And that became the family burying ground, and neighbors started coming in, burying their family there too. And when those families died out, younger generations forget where the cemetery was. And so we don't know where our ancestors were buried. This little piece of paper tells you that William Matthews and his wife were interred in this piece of property. Their graves to this date are not marked, but the James Matthews, the Joseph F. Morton married one of his daughters, and George Field married another daughter. Those people are buried in this same plot, and it's still in existence today. It has a rock wall around it. I had hoped to go get a photograph of it. There's not a good photograph on Find a Grave for it. So I need to do that next pretty day I've got. So look out for cemetery deeds. This is another deed where you've got the widow marrying again, and her husband is acting and selling property that belonged to her late husband. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to totally transcribe it. I should have done, but it's the Crow and Burnett family in Clark County. And it names on the second part of it, you see over here, you've got the names of the heirs who are signing away their right to this property so that it can be sold by the widow's new husband. Hopefully the heirs got a piece of the proceeds, but I don't know. Always follow the money. This was one of my mother's mantras that she preached everywhere she went. Follow the money. Records are made because money is involved. They levied taxes on land, carriages, horses, livestock, watches, tobacco, distilled spirits. That was a separate, just a spirit tax. It's not a tax like income tax or holdings, your estate taxes, and slaves, but they didn't have an income tax like we have to pay. And for many years, there was a poll tax that was levied for usually white men over 21. If they wanted to vote, they had to pay the poll tax. It's usually about $1. And I'm sorry to say that many in the 1870s and 80s, after the slaves were freed and given the right to vote, a lot of counties used the poll tax. They jacked the price up so that the slaves, the former slaves, would not be able to afford to pay to be able to vote. It was totally unfair practices, but it happened. And people who did not pay the poll tax would be published in the newspapers. So you can find, if your family, if you want to know maybe when your family left an area, look in the newspapers for a tax defaulters list, which might mean that they have left the country or left the county. And the levels of taxation and the type of land that they had and the number of livestock and slaves that the family had can give you a good overview of a family's fortune over the years. So it's worth digging into those big books. Now we're going to go over to the Superior Court. For those of you who are Sherlock Holmes or what's the lawyer, the court case lawyer, anyway, all these court case TV shows, Judge Judy or whatever, these are in the Superior Court. They're either civil courts, which is civil, just day-to-day suits, slander, divorce, things like that, or criminal court, which records are kept separately. Unfortunately, a lot of those records have not been indexed or digitized. A lot of them, the early ones, have been digitized by the LDS in the 60s, but you have to go page by page by page to find your family. And also the full testimony from the entire case may not be recorded in these books. They may have folders with the testimony separately from the court books, or they could have been chucked out by an extra careful or tidy judge or office holder long time ago, because they didn't need these old dusty papers. They weren't any good anymore. So that's our loss. But sometimes if the case was really worth reading, it made it to the newspaper and in great detail. Aliens who moved into the county prior to the Civil War would also declare their intention to get a naturalization and to apply for citizenship in the Superior Court of the local county. And those records also would be in that office. This is an illustration of a page that's the docket book, showing what cases were being brought to before the court for the March term of 1802. You've got slander between King Roberts and Nathan Gann, and the judge made them both pay the fees for the suit. William Stiles, executor of Bernard Kelly versus William Smith. Got a typo there, I need to fix it. Ephraim Jones and John Clements. These are evidently people who have squatted on the property of Bernard Kelly. And William Stiles is trying to get them moved off the land, and it was turned over to be continued at the September term. They only met twice a year. Elizabeth Hendon, by her next friend, Elijah Hendon versus William Dean. This next friend is an interesting term. In the 1800s, a woman had no standing and no right to take her problem before the court. She had to get a man to stand as her next friend, as that's how they termed it. It could be a brother, could be an uncle, could be just a friend off the street that agreed to stand up for her. And he would go into the court, bring the suit against whomever she had the complaint against. And then it was taken before the court and judged, and a verdict would be reached. William Miller is an endorsee. He's evidently bought a note of hand from someone, and Benjamin Rice owed the money to the original person that had the note. So William Miller's trying to get Benjamin Rice to settle up and pay that note. So the jury lists were drawn about a month before each court date, and they would be published in the newspaper so that everybody would know that John Blow and Joe Smith and Tom Turpin were to be on the grand jury, and other names would be on the petit jury, which is the court. The grand jury did the management of the county properties and things like that. And they also decided whether court cases had sufficient evidence to be brought before the court as an actual case. This managed the load of the judge. If somebody came to court with a frivolous suit and the grand jury says, you haven't got enough evidence to bring a suit, and they throw it out, so that does not show up in the docket book. Jurors in the early years were white, male, over 21, and typically only landowners. In the 1840s, they started allowing non-landowning white males to be chosen for the jury. And if they were chosen for the jury and they didn't show up, they would be fined, and that fine also was published in the paper, which made for big scandal. After the Civil War, the freed slaves and the free blacks got the right to vote. And as we mentioned earlier, the poll tax was implemented and jacked up to keep those people from exercising their right in the years following Reconstruction, to keep them in their place. A totally unfair practice, of course. The judge of the Superior Court would also appoint justices of the peace. These were men who were well thought of in the community, who had the authority to perform marriages and to sign documents for legal documents for people to certify that they were genuine documents. A notary public is another one of the offices that a judge could appoint. But both of these people, if you see JP or NP after someone's name, you can just about guarantee that they had a high standing in the community and were trusted people, because they wouldn't have gotten the justice of the peace or the notary public position if they had not kept their nose clean and done their business like they should, and basically operated as a decent person. Appointed for 3 months at a time.
Eve, I think it cut out again right after.
Okay. Yeah,
right
it just
after,
says.
it was right after operated as a decent person. So it may have been as you switched to this slide, but.
Okay. Be decent person was where I ended that slide.
So yes, starting with this slide would
Okay.
be good.
The types of juries in Georgia counties, there were typically 3 kinds. Grand jury would be appointed for a 3-month term to review the management of the county to be sure the office holders were doing what they were supposed to be doing, that the county buildings, the county farm, the courthouse, any other entities that are associated with the government of the county were being run effectively and in good repair. And if the grand jury feels like something needs to be done to improve something, they would bring that to the attention of the entire public, usually in the grand jury report at the end of the term. They also got to sit in and get the initial hearing of any case that was brought or wanted to be brought to court in the county, whether it be civil or criminal. The county judges or county lawyers had to gather sufficient evidence to prove to the grand jury that they had a valid case and enough evidence to convict or to at least examine the people who were part of the case. If it turned out to be a frivolous suit because Jane Doe slapped Sally Ann and Sally Ann didn't like it, so she sued her for assault, it might get thrown out. They'd have to argue it out amongst themselves. The petit jury, petit meaning like petite, small, might not be the full 12 people. And they would be seated to listen to a particular trial, either civil or criminal, examine the evidence, go into sequestration, and argue the evidence to be sure that and come to a verdict. And then they would turn the verdict over to the judge, and the judge would set the sentence. Serious civil or criminal cases go to the traverse jury. The petit jury is basically the small time cases. Always, always, always check the newspapers for all of these records, because the newspapers were the county legal organ. The newspaper, if there were more than one newspaper in the city, like in Savannah, you had about 4 newspapers in the early 1800s, and they had to take turns as being the legal organ for a certain period of time. So you would have to investigate the archives of those newspapers to see which ones published the legal notices, the sales, the estate, all the estate things that we talked about at the last gathering would be published in the newspaper. And in places where the records are burned, your newspapers may be the only source of records that you can find. As you can see from these are Brunswick and Savannah newspapers that I found on the Digital Library of Georgia.
I think it cut out again right after that. I found on the Digital Library of Georgia.
Okay. The long one in the middle is from the Brunswick Advocate, 1837, and it gives their guidelines for publishing legal notices. This was a fairly new newspaper, and he wanted to be sure that everybody knew exactly what they had to do. That it was a fairly new newspaper, and he wanted everybody to know what he needed to be able to print the legal notices for them for a fee, of course. The top one is from the Savannah, Georgian, 1832. And it's a sheriff's marshal's sale. And it's a plantation in Bryan County called Mulberry Hill, consisting of 450 acres. And it goes to describe the property, what's on the property, what they grew on the property, and the names of the slaves that are also being sold is in this same ad. And if you'll notice at the bottom, the Charleston Courier is requested to publish the above twice a week until the sale. So not only the Savannah, Georgia newspaper got coverage for this estate being sold, but they tried to get the wealthy market out of Charleston, South Carolina to come to the sale. They wanted deep pockets, obviously. The bottom one with the little clip says Runaway. From Going Swamp on Monday night, two Negro fellows, Dick, and it describes him, and Ned describes him as they both have relatives in Brunswick County. It's very likely they may be in that vicinity. $10 will be given to apprehension of each on the application to be subscriber. F.M. Scarlett, Oak Grove, Glenn County. That's 1837. And you would frequently see runaways advertised in the newspaper. And I often wondered how many of them were captured and sent back to slavery. Where can you find newspapers? Back in the old days, when I was growing up, we'd have to go to the library and actually read the real newspapers in the archives at the Georgia Archives or Savannah and early Athens newspapers in their collection. And I remember as a kid seeing the 1700s very thick paper newspapers and turning them very carefully so it won't damage them to find information that Mama was looking for a book. That's pretty special for a kid of about 10 or 12 to be able to see something that was over 200 years old in their own hands. Fortunately for us now, the Georgia Historic Newspapers Project with the Digital Library of Georgia is digitizing at least one newspaper per county, all 159 counties in the state, and putting them online for free. They're pretty much very searchable. The search engine's not as easy to use, but it's adequate. Plus, you can actually save the picture of the page where you find an article that you want to keep to your computer. You can download it either as a PDF file or as a JPEG, a digital file. And that's the thing that my poor computer's overloaded with JPEGs like that and PDFs. And if you do it as a JPEG, you can crop it and put it up like on Find a Grave. If you found an obituary for somebody, and you can post it on Find a Grave as evidence of biographical evidence of somebody whose grave marker is on Find a Grave, and then becomes additional resources and additional documentation. The Library of Congress is also digitizing newspapers from all over the country. And I've not used that collection very much, but if you've got people in other states or even in Georgia, You could look there. Genealogybank.com has digitized a lot of early Southern newspapers, was what they started with, especially Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. When they first started about 10 years ago, they were about the only digital newspaper service that had the Southern area that I was working. And so I promptly paid my $79 for a year subscription, and I use it about every week to look up something. Newspapers.com is now owned by Ancestry, and you can get it as an add-on to your Ancestry membership. I think it's like $57 for a year to get the extra editor's access, which allows you to save the actual file to your computer. If you don't pay extra for the newspapers.com, you can do a clipping and it just attaches to your record in your Ancestry tree record, but you don't have the actual JPEG that you can share or read at your leisure. Google is a good way to find what records are where and what newspapers might be where. If you want to know if I live at Pocatello, Georgia. Now, if I wanted to know if Pocatello ever had a newspaper, I'd go to Google and search Pocatello GA newspaper. I know they didn't, because this is just a little crossroads. But it's one way to find out if you're not sure. These are some more from the Digital Library of Georgia collections of Savannah and Brunswick newspapers. The top left one, in his 75th year of his age, in Port William, Kentucky, James Blair Esquire, the father of the editor of this print, so the Savannah Daily Georgian, his father died on the 7th instant. You know what instant means, don't you? That means the 7th of this month. If you see a date and ultimo, ULT, that means last month. Instant is this month, ultimo is last month. And then this little tiny square gives a very brief detail about Mr. James Blair Esquire. In early life, he immigrated from Virginia to Kentucky. He served in the legislature of Virginia and was for many years Attorney General for Kentucky. While engaged in the slave business, can't read that, business of his profession as a lawyer, he was not unmindful of his duties as a member of the Presbyterian Church, of which he was an elder. It is a consolation to his children to feel that a life and exemplary virtue and religious faith made his death a transmission to a happier world. So he lived a high and useful life, it sounds like. (1837), Elias B. Hart versus Sarah S. Hart. Elias came before the sheriff and said that he wanted to divorce his wife, Sarah Hart, and she was supposed to come to the court and appear and give her side of the story. And we'd have to follow the newspapers later on to find out what she did and whether the divorce was actually granted. And you might even get in other parts of the newspaper, the juicy gossip about the divorce. So just don't read just the legal ads. Go look at the body of the paper too. On the top right one is a sale of land for the benefit of the heirs of John Fox Jr., deceased, on the Little Ogeechee River, 12 miles from Savannah, late the residence of John Fox Jr., deceased, containing 800 acres in 4 separate tracts. The late residence of Jonathan Fox, deceased, of which 400 acres was granted to John Fox Sr., deceased. See, this sale here is giving you a title, delineation of title for the estate of John Fox Jr. You might not have had that anywhere else. And the next place to go would be go look at the deed records and see what it shows, and the estate records. As I said before, my computer is full of JPEGs and PDF files of newspaper clippings. And the way I sort through them, when I save them to my computer, I use the file name as a method to give me clues on what is in the clipping. I usually start with the last name first, then the first name, and an event, maybe marriage, death, obit, divorce, sale, anything like that. Then I put a hyphen and then the name of the newspaper, the city and state, date of the issue, and the page number. And sometimes I put the column number if I'm really industrious. I don't always do that. Just the page number. I want to be able to go back and find that same little clipping again if somebody else wants to know where it came from. At the very end of the file, you can put up to 64 letters in a file name. If you use Windows, I'm not sure about a Mac. But you can end the file. I put at the end of the file name a 3-letter code or 2-letter code of what archive I found that clipping in. So I put DLG for the Digital Library of Georgia. You've seen those in the captions of the clippings we've had here. NP is from newspapers, and GB I use for Genealogy Bank. And if you found it on Ancestry, just ANC. This gives you a clue. I remember reading that, but where did I find it? If you can't go back and find it again, you've shot yourself in the foot. Okay. And for those of us who've been researching for quite a while, we've had the blessing of the LDS Church, the Mormon Church representatives, traveling all over the country in the 1950s and 60s with portable microfilm cameras, taking microfilm of court record books, any that they could get their hands on. And thanks to that diligence, we've been able to do a lot of research sitting in an archive or a library on a microfilm reader instead of paying to go to a hotel and digging through the dusty vaults and hoping that record is still there. The reels of microfilm are now digitized. I found out last week and they're available on Family Search. Unfortunately, they're not all indexed yet, but they are digitized. So you go into the research wiki of the Family Search website and go to the county and then go look for the actual type of records, and it will take you to that digitized book, and you can scroll through at the beginning, and see what you can find in it. Many of the original books had a little tiny index with pages with one letter on each page bound into the front of the book, and that's where the clerk was to enter the name of the deceased or the name of the whoever in the index, and that sometimes and the page number where you find them. But again, if you've got more than one person involved in a suit or in a deed record, the index is limited. And if you just use the index and don't go checking through the book itself, you may miss the records. Now that you've got all this evidence gathered up and in your hot little hands, what are you going to do with it? If you can't use the research you found, what's the reason for doing it? As we talked about in the probate section last time, go through each page, make a note of who's involved with it, how they're involved, and make some notes showing relationships, maybe to the deceased, whether it's a stepchild or granddaughter or whatever indications you can find from your records. Write your, just because you read it and think, I know what that is. If you don't write it down right then while you're thinking about it, and 10 years from now, when you pull that record out again, what I remember thinking something about it, but what was it? My dear mother got a fortune cookie one time, and she carried it in her wallet the rest of her life. A good memory is not as good as pale ink. Ink lasts a lot longer than your memory does. She laughed so hard when she opened that fortune cookie, and it was so appropriate. Share your research with others. Who knows, your piece that you're sharing with them may trigger something with them, and they say, oh, I've got the Bible for that family. And you've just hit pay dirt. But if you had not shared with that person, you never would have known. Leave no stone unturned, as Mom always said. And I thank you for your attention.